I'm Joe Dowling, Director of the Guthrie Theater, and on behalf of the Cowles family and of the board and staff of the Guthrie, it's my pleasure to welcome you here today for this celebration of the life and work of one of our most distinguished citizens and a lifetime board member of the Guthrie, John Cowles Jr. Today's ceremony will be about remembering John and celebrating his extraordinary life and his many achievements. It's also a family event, where those closest to him will have a chance to remind us of how special he was as a vital member of our community, and most importantly, as a husband, a father, a grandfather, and a great-grandfather. We at the Guthrie are very grateful to the Cowles family for choosing the Guthrie as the venue for this public celebration of John Cowles. It is appropriate that we celebrate his life here because without John's vision, determination, and perseverance, the creation of this theatre almost 50 years ago would never have happened. Indeed, his enthusiasm and his brilliant co-chairmanship of the Architect Selection Committee played a most significant part in the creation of the new Guthrie on the banks of the Mississippi River. All of us at the Guthrie, as well as many arts and civic organizations in this community, owe John Cowles a great debt. Following this ceremony, there will be a reception in the lobbies where, in a more informal way, we can share memories of John with Sage, Tessa, Jay, Jane, Fuller, and all their families. A video booth has been erected in the lobby to allow friends to record some reminiscences, which can be enjoyed at a later date by all the family.
When the Cowles family gathered recently to discuss today's remarks, they advised each other and me to not portray John as a saint. I have to admit that had not occurred to me. Despite his many accomplishments so adequately described in the fine Star Tribune obituary, as well as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many other publications, his civic career, many accomplishments, and philanthropy were indeed extraordinary. But far beyond that, John Cowles was one of the most interesting and eclectic people I have ever met. This scion of a distinguished family, a product of Exeter and Harvard, a cerebral and scholarly man, also loved action novels, Tom Clancy in particular. And when he learned that the Loft was featuring Vince Flynn as the keynote speaker of their thriller and mystery writers conference, he wanted to be sure that Jossie Hale knew that Flynn supported torture in his novels, but then quickly clarified that he happened to be an avid reader of Vince Flynn and was not opposed to him speaking at the Loft. He just wanted to be sure that Jossie was aware of that fact. And this impulse to inform others seemed to run through his life. Educate and be educated. Nothing gave him greater pleasure than gathering interesting people around a dinner table and teeing up group conversation. He would tolerate the initial social small talk as long as he could, and then tap his glass and call for general conversation. Always started by him with a leading question. Should Red China be admitted to the UN? Are we making progress on cracking the glass ceiling? What can we do to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels? And on over so many venues, from their home at Spring Hill many years ago to the corporate lodge Glendalough in northwest Minnesota, to their renovated Flash Electric home down the street from here. By the way, the first pioneers in the residential development of this part of town. He shifted his subject matter to a more personal level as the years went on, but the impulse remained. A few years ago, 6 of us went walking in Wales for a week, and John suggested each evening that one of us talk about his or her family background, upbringing, interests, and outlook on life. He was the one who directed the order of presentation. but curiously never got around to his own story. And I pondered that. Dark secrets he wanted to suppress, more interest in others than himself, or perhaps just ever so slightly disorganized. However, I quickly rejected the last reason, because being highly organized seemed to be one of his most obvious characteristics. Now, many of us are news junkies, as was John in the extreme. But while others may have journals and magazines strewn about in random piles, John kept his in most orderly piles, worthy of the best library reading room. He may not have read them all, but they were there in perfect order. And over many years, he loved to plan and organize trips with close friends to various parts of the world. And I do believe the planning and organizing part was the most enjoyable for him. In preparing for a week of walking the moors of Devon some 35 years ago, he instructed all the participants to buy British Army Ordnance maps of the area and to study them carefully. It seemed far more precise than necessary, as the local tourist bureau's walking map would have sufficed. But Sherlock Holmes aficionado Paul Parker told him it was a splendid idea, so that we might know exactly where to hide in case the Hound of the Baskervilles appeared. I believe John just loved the detail and precision of those maps, and not only assumed, but wanted each of us to share his enjoyment. Further to his attention to or tolerance of detail, he was the one in this most wonderful partnership with Sage, who ground through the excruciating detail involved in their house moves over the years. They always agreed on the big issues, location, layout, architect, and so on, but in visiting the hardware, light fixture, or plumbing displays, his eyes never glazed, but stayed focused on the task at hand until it was finished properly. Perhaps that same focus and patience is what brought the Guthrie Theater to this community, or what prevailed in the grueling struggle to build the Metrodome some 30 years ago. And who knows, if John had been leading the effort for the new Vikings Stadium, one can only wonder if the effort would have been so exhausting, sucking the air out of every other project on the legislative calendar for these past few years. On that note, who present will forget the moment in the Minneapolis 2025 panel a few months ago when questioning remarks were made concerning the lack of economic development around the Humphrey Metrodome. And John Cowles, now carrying an oxygen tank, immediately went to the microphone and in a strong, clear voice made it quite clear that there were never economic development ambitions on the east end of downtown at that time. Always a voice of authority, always respectful of facts. Perhaps that interest in facts and objectivity came from his journalistic background. There is the story of his joining the paper shortly after his military service and entering the newsroom as a cub reporter on the police beat, even though everyone knew it was just a matter of time before he would ascend to higher leadership of the enterprise. But he impressed everyone with his diligence and luck. Shortly after he started, he came across a dead body in the alley behind his home on Thomas Avenue, called the police, and then reported in the story dutifully and professionally. Later, his close friend, Mike Winton, suggested to him, "John, you know, maybe you went too far in getting that scoop." Many years later, during the most tumultuous period at Cowles Media, John temporarily returned as publisher of the flagship Star Tribune, and his first act was to walk onto the news floor and quietly make the rounds to chat with reporters. There was a palpable air of relief over the room, because everyone there knew that John Cowles respected news, respected journalists, and he believed to the core of his being that news, objective, thorough news, was the living, beating heart of a newspaper. He did have a great desire to get things right, whether it be in the professional journalism of a news story or the hardware in their new space in the Mill District. On that same walking trip in Wales, the six of us, in a moment of giddiness the third night out, decided to all order martinis at a rather stuffy old lordly manor turned country inn. And the first round, delivered by a faithful retainer straight out of upstairs downstairs, was simply wrong. Just glasses of martini and Rossi, vermouth, no gin. The first call to send them back was easy, but when she returned with basically the same mix but in different shaped glasses, we began to waver. Ugly Americans, international incident, rude guests. Maybe we should just suck it up, literally and figuratively. But John insisted that we try again and get it right. One could just see the thoughts scrolling across the screen. I'm never going to have another chance to have a real martini with good friends in Wales. I want to get it right. So he patiently, politely, and precisely, as was his wont, described just what we had in mind. And the dutiful lady, a patient and polite soul herself, suddenly declared, "Oh, you want an American martini." Who knew? And the third try was excellent. His love of precision manifested itself in many ways. For about the first 3 years of answering machines, he would leave messages in his solemn voice. "This is John Cowles, C-O-W-L-E." In the final year or two of his life, in relative comfort, so he was not going to pursue further treatment. But the primary motivation, it seems, was that of celebrating his 80th birthday by taking his whole family to Istanbul. And when I asked him why, he replied, "I just want to be sure that the younger generation think of the future as more than the Pacific Rim countries." Well, I don't know his entire family well, but I suspect that this bit of knowledge had already seeped through to them. And John probably knew that also, but he just wanted to be sure, and he knew this was his last chance. In his determination to educate and enlighten, he would often send out articles. Most were relevant to interests we had in common, or dealt with things that I was interested in. But every once in a while, one would come in from left field, and I would ponder it. Yeah, I know he's now studying agricultural economics at the university, but is the future of sugar beet production in the Red River Valley really something I should know about? I always tried to understand the impulse behind such an article, and thought out various descriptors, but the one I always rejected was goofy. For if there was one word and one word only in the English language that did not fit John Cowles, that was it. On the other hand, if there was one word and one word only that did fit him, I believe it was gravitas. He just had that air about him. This was a solid, significant person who radiated gravitas. Once during the early days of the Dutch Elm disaster in Minneapolis, I was chatting on the street with his neighbor, Martin Friedman, and we saw a municipal vehicle pull up and paint the dreaded red circle on a magnificent cathedral elm on the curb of the Cowles Mount Curve home. Martin turned to me and he said, "We're doomed." If it can happen to John Cowles, it can happen to anyone. As though somehow this thoughtful, intelligent, determined civic leader could just put up his hand, or, more likely, pull together a well-chosen working group and patiently work out a plan to hold back the tsunami of Dutch elm disease. Despite the obvious gravitas, there was also that whole other side, first displayed some 65 years ago when Fun Lover John, the very ironic moniker this solemn, bespectacled Harvard undergraduate had acquired, startled his fellow groomsmen at a Philadelphia bachelor's party by getting up on a table and doing a flamenco dance so enthusiastically that the table collapsed. And the next day, when one of the wedding guests a radiant young dancer named Sage Fuller, heard the story, she wanted to know more about this serious but exuberant fellow. Such impulses submerged during his long and meaningful business and civic life, but then surfaced again after his painful departure from the daily operation of Cowles Media, when he briefly took up motorcycling the back roads around Franconia, joined the Bill T. Jones Dance Company on a world tour, wrote poetry, and studied agricultural economics, among other things. We had a family wedding 10 years ago and seated John next to a very close family friend, a native German, a professor of German and European culture in Indiana. And afterwards, Andreas said, "Say, who was that guy I was sitting next to at dinner? He asked me one intelligent question after another about Thomas Mann, about German language, about Bismarck, about the wars. Finally, I asked him what he did, and he said, 'I'm an aerobics instructor.'" As for his poetry, it was quite good. At least I am so advised by Jim Moore, one of our 6 Wales walkers. I could read one about memorial services, but then there wouldn't be one because he was generally opposed to the idea and the format. However, here is one. The lucky man will, in his lifetime, have 2 great love affairs, one early, one late. And if he's really lucky, he will be seized with and by the same person, thus being granted the gift of sharing a long history together. John Cowles was a serious man, but he didn't take himself too seriously. I do believe he enjoyed being teased. At least I sure hope so. And once I noticed a large ball of rubber bands he had carefully and precisely saved. I said to him, "John, I hate to break the news to you, but rubber bands do disintegrate over time." He thought about that for a moment, and then replied with that wonderful twinkle, "We will all miss so much." Yes, but in the meantime, they can be useful, just like us, just like us.
My name is Tessa Sage Flores. In 1952, when Sage married John, I was 3 years old. He got a 2-for-1 deal, and I got an amazing second father, whom I came to love with all my heart. I did have my doubts at first, but he turned out all right. John liked the poem I'm going to read, and he asked that it be read on this occasion. The Long Boat by Stanley Kunitz. When his boat snapped loose from its mooring under the squeaking of the gulls, he tried at first to wave to his dear ones on shore. But in the rolling fog, they had already lost their faces. Too tired even to choose between jumping and calling. Somehow he felt absolved and free of his burdens. Those mottos stamped on his name tag: conscience, ambition, and all that caring. He was content to lie down with the family ghosts in the slop of his cradle, buffeted by the storm, endlessly drifting. Peace. Peace. To be rocked by the infinite, as if it didn't matter which way was home, as if he didn't know he loved the earth so much he wanted to stay forever.
My name is Jay Cowles. I'm the oldest child of John and Sage. And no, I'm not about to sing Morning is Broken by Cat Stevens. You will be treated to that a bit later by some much better voices. On behalf of Sage and all of the family members here, I want to also thank you for joining us this afternoon in our celebration of John. And also thank you for your many kind notes of support and expressions of remembrance for John. That serves to remind us that he lives on in many, many hearts and memories. For me, John is first and foremost Dad. How grateful I am to be his son. I admire him so because of his courage, his kindness, and his rock-solid integrity. I love him so because he loved me warmly and unconditionally, as he did each of his children and grandchildren. And best of all, he offered me the example of his own life. Rich, shaped by principle and character. Dad loved to learn. He inhaled news and information as though it were oxygen. Any place that Dad spent time soon had a massive dictionary, the latest world atlas, and a steady stream of newspapers, magazines, and books. And Dad loved to learn from every person that he met. He was the master of gently probing questions about your background and your interests. He loved a good dinner conversation. He was also very inclusive with in-laws, with extended family, with neighbors, with shopkeepers, with waitstaff, with all the people in the community. Dad seemed to believe everyone matters. Dad was a natural and skilled teacher. His rich knowledge of history as well as current events elevated virtually any discussion. But Dad was also a master of process, of systems, of well-organized environments at home and at work. And he was forever imparting his knowledge on these subjects to his more unruly family members, which is to say, all of us. Dad taught us how to organize almost anything. A pencil jar, a meeting agenda, the layout of a room, an overseas trip, and as we children grew older, helped us to turn our own dreams into reality, whether a professional women's softball league, a home for literary and book arts, or an outdoor sculpture park for young artists. A few snapshots. At the annual Christmas Eve bonfire as a child on the edge of Long Lake, Dad often led the singing of Christmas carols with his sturdy baritone while sparks lit up the night. Dad was compassionate and gentle in most things, but playing tennis was a clear exception. He loved an aggressive game of tennis, terrorizing his opponents with his net play. Finally, Dad visited the island of Antigua throughout his life, always to the southeast coast where the trade winds arrived from Africa. I like to remember Dad there, looking out to sea, thoughtful, a slight smile on his lips, the trade winds mussing his hair and whispering in his ears. He's looking out to that distant horizon line. I imagine he's thinking, what's just over that horizon? What's blowing my way? And he's relaxed, and he's curious, and he's looking forward to the next adventure.
Nice to have you here. I am Jane, the second child of John and Sage. I want to share a tale of connections that brought friendship and respect into the fold of my relationship with Dad. When I was in middle school in the late 60s, Dad drove me to school most mornings. Naturally, he would ask questions, school life, friends, occasionally even offer to quiz me in vocabulary. One thing I noticed, that he always had the same lapel pin on his suit, consistently every morning. I finally asked what ERA stood for. Equal Rights Amendment. And without judgment in his voice, he went on to explain what it stood for and why it was so important to him. Geez, a father with an open mind and quietly wore his beliefs. Time passed. My college studies took me into the field of physical therapy, sports medicine. My father in the late 1980s traded in his business suits for brightly colored spandex shorts and t-shirts and began moving to the beat of the music. When he became an aerobics instructor, Dad pushed the envelope of gender equity for men over 60 to become one of a handful of male instructors in the Twin Cities. This new body of knowledge gave the two of us a common language with which we began to explore and discuss the amazing human body and various ways to take care of it. He clearly loved being a student, and he would send me news clippings and articles that he found interesting and informative. In 1989, I approached Dad with the question, how does one go about starting a pro sports league for women? I'm sure he said, good question. This moment demonstrated several things to me. One, I felt safe to approach Dad with such a question and no brush off of, that's too big of a dream. He really listened. Secondly, I was very aware that he cared deeply that women athletes deserved the opportunity to have careers playing their sport. It was a real gift for me to work alongside Dad, as well as my brother Jay, on developing the Pro Fast Pitch League. It was an exhilarating 15 years run, and Mom, our most reliable fan in both the research and design phase, as well as in the stands. The league even continues to operate as we speak. Opening games begin June 7th. Rather remarkable. My father came by these attributes of gender equity and women's rights honestly. His grandmother, Florence Call, was among the first group of women to graduate from Northwestern. Dad's mother, Betty Cowles, was an early leader in the history of Planned Parenthood in Iowa, as well as captain of the women's basketball team for Smith College. My journey with Dad had many adventures as well as some steep learning curves. I will continue my journey now without him as an active participant. I will carry forward with me a sense of curiosity, worthiness, and well-being, qualities that were nurtured by my father and gifts I will always be grateful for. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Fuller Cowles, bottom of the pile, youngest. There are two points I'd like to share with you today about. My father was a wonderful role model, good disciplinarian, even though it didn't come out terribly often, but it was good. First, for him growing up in a big publishing family, he had some pressure about moving into the publishing world. And he had an uncle, Russell, and I have another uncle, Russell, here today, who had a good painter career as a landscape painter and was the American Academy of Rome Fellow, who was a large influence on John growing up. And the moral of the story is John knew that being in the publishing world, him being the third generation family business, that there's a fair amount of luggage that comes along with moving into that business. It was fairly lofty work. And one of John's gifts for me was letting me know that it's okay not to be an artist, or not to move into publishing, but to be an artist in life. And it was a good, valid career. And we have a long history on both Sage's side. Sage's mother was a great sculptor, and we've got lots of arts running in our family. So John's gift, beyond being a parent, for me was really the letting me know it's okay not to have to be in journalism. And secondly, as you've heard about John today, and everyone's experience today is unique with John, and that, as Roger and Jay have touched on, is one of John's great qualities in life. The way he can make you feel important in the conversation you're having at that moment is wonderful. But for John, his work in the arts with Martin making the Walker Art Center and the Guthrie or dance, it really wasn't about the finished product of the art object or the sculpture or the great painting that was the result. John was most fascinated with the interaction with the people making the art and the passionate executive directors, the artists that he'd get to meet, and the people who are really going to take it to the next level, who are passionate about their art. So his deep love of that conversation, that juice, that little nut about what drives, is, for me, and everyone in the room's experience of John's real juice. So we're here today as a community to remember and celebrate, and I love seeing everybody here. Thank you for coming.
I'm at the bottom of the pile too. I'm John's younger brother by 7 years. My name is Russell Cowles. I've lived in Minneapolis most of my life, and I really am very fortunate to have had such a great older brother as John. And I'll share a few stories with you about that. But first, I wanted to read a few words from our sister Sarah, who lives in Massachusetts, who for health reasons couldn't be here today. So here is her eulogy for John. I loved my brother John. I was almost 3 years old when I first saw him lying in a small, old-fashioned baby bed in a darkened room. He grew into a skinny boy whose legs seemed always mottled with eczema or poison ivy in the summers, and who carried a box of Kleenex under his arm against unending hay fever. Although he was wiry and strong and always full of energy, I remember few quarrels between us. He was very honest and also very reasonable and realistic. Somehow, even as a child, he had to be respected. It seemed he was always trying to figure life out, test its boundaries, discover its meaning, what this matter of being alive is all about. And I think his parents would also have agreed that through all his growing up, he wanted to be faithful to a moral code that seemed to be deeply imprinted within him. One day, he was at college, and I was in a jam and troubled. He wrote me a letter that was so kind and thoughtful that I kept it and still have it today. I doubt he ever knew the difference that letter made to me. John lived in a big world, both outwardly and inwardly. His interests seemed to range from A to Z. He cared enormously about his family, about Sage and their 4 children. But he made a big difference to my children too. He wanted to be in touch with all of his many, many relatives and friends. He seemed to care about everyone around him, about this community, this city in which he lived, and over time manifested that interest and care in a multitude of ways. Among his many talents, he had the gift of making poetry. About 10 years ago, a small collection of his poems was gathered. The last page in that collection is, however, not poetry, but prose. It is a time frame of the history of our planet Earth, beginning with the Big Bang 13.7 billion years ago, and ending with the apparently inevitable end not only of this planet, but of our entire universe. Looking at this chart, John saw the truth of impermanence, that everything is always changing. Time is always going by. Nothing is going to last. We all, each one of us, inevitably is going to die. This deepening understanding was the backdrop against which he lived his life. And yet he apparently learned through his own experience that in order to feel fulfilled and truly happy, we must nonetheless live our lives as well as possibly we can, not only for our own sake, but for the sake of others. Here is a brief poem entitled Time that heads the collection of John's poetry. It is written in the third person. He walked the shore, watching the days roll in from the horizon. None identical, though relentless in their rhythm. None long enough to do all he would do. And when at last he left, in less than half a day, the next high tide washed clean his traces from the sand. It will be far longer than half a day, however, before I forget the difference that John made to me. That written by our older sister, Sarah. I want to say thank you all for being here and helping me and our family grieve and celebrate the life of my brother John. And a special thanks to Joe Dowling and the Guthrie board and the staff for making it possible and convenient and easy for us to celebrate John's life in this place that was so dear to his heart. I too love John very much. As his junior by 7 years, my early memories of him were as a playful dog owner, pianist, and drummer. He welcomed my presence when he was hammering out boogie woogie on the piano or jazz rhythms on his drum set. And he delighted and surprised me by teaching his golden retriever, Rocky, to jump over the wall of his kennel. When I encountered a rough spot in high school during my senior year, he and Sage graciously invited me to live with them in their new house on Thomas Avenue. He and Sage were only a year or so into their new marriage, and she was tending her daughter Tessa as well as their first infant son, Jay. He was busy researching and writing as a rookie reporter, as Roger so aptly described, for the Star Tribune. So once again, John took me under his wing with Sage and provided a loving and welcoming home for me. When I moved back to Minneapolis in the mid-1960s, John and Sage often included me and my family as guests at social events they hosted. He introduced me to his friends, many of whom are here now, and whom I think of as having made vital contributions to my own process of maturing, for which I'm deeply indebted. In 1975, for 5 weeks, he and Sage lovingly housed and cared for my 2 older children, one of whom is here today. Her younger sister came down with a chicken pox while they were staying with John and Sage during that 5-week period. And subsequently, John offered to be my supporting family member during my early days in group therapy. While working at the Star Tribune and with attending to all his involvements in this community, he also attended 2-hour-long weekly sessions with me for over a year. He never missed one. His and Sage's love of dance, architecture, and the arts shaped my life choices and interests in a myriad of ways for which I am truly grateful, many of which persist to this day. John was committed not only to his own family, but to all those connections with his siblings and their children, as well as with his cousins and in-laws. In the 1970s, he and Sage took over the management of our family summer camp for 4 years so that I and my children could grow and enhance our relationships with him and his family and that of our sisters and their children and their friends as well. Since the early 1980s, John played an active role in overseeing the financial management of assets for me and my family. He spent a lot of time as executor of our father's estate during a complicated time at Cowles Media, when both his family as well as the family business was demanding increasing amounts of his thoughtful care and attention. As Roger Hale mentioned in his eulogy, John loved espionage, action, adventure, books, and movies, as do I. We also enjoy the prophetic science-based writings of Michael Crichton. We love Robert Ludlum, Tom Clancy, and Jack Higgins. John gave me several original hardcover copies of Ian Fleming's first books of James Bond, which I truly treasure. For the last 20 years, I've been especially blessed by his company at monthly luncheons. We discussed family, relationships, politics, and issues of the day. It was great fun to spend time with him, and I often sought his advice or counsel on many matters. He was patient and listened attentively. Never one to sacrifice reason for emotion, he often provided helpful new perspectives on complex problems. John loved history and literature. During our four-sibling trip to Greece in the 1990s, his comments greatly enhanced the pleasure and enjoyment of our travels by putting sites, architecture, and artwork in an historical, cultural, and literary context. He believed in staying fit and encouraged me to do so, and shared articles about health and fitness with me, many of which have served as helpful guides for my own well-being. I will miss my brother and yet feel surrounded by so much of the goodness that he brought forth during his life. All of you gathered here. His wonderful and sometimes counterintuitive philosophy, as well as an appreciation for the dance, literature, and performing arts. As a philanthropist, he was a wonderful role model. Happily, his spirit lives on in Sage and his children, whom I dearly love and appreciate, as well as in the institutions he helped to establish or flourish. A few years ago, John revealed another wonderful facet of his persona, that of creating poetry, which was, I thought, a powerful reflection of his deeply spiritual nature. I will close with one of his poems entitled, One More Time. One more time. I find I want to connect one more time with certain people in my life, especially those whom I have neglected or wronged, but also with those whose lives I have touched in a happy or successful way for one last celebration. It need not take long. Just a moment will do. With those I have wronged or with whom I feel incomplete, it will take a little longer, but not much. Just a few words of apology, or to bring us, or me at least, with them, up to date. I don't seek to be forgiven, only to complete the forgiving of myself. And for the happy times, just one more moment of sharing the joy, sharing our lives with others, for better or for worse, is like breathing. Thank you.
Mayeron Cowles, married to Fuller.
And I am Paige Knudsen Cowles, married to Jay, and we are daughters-in-law of Sage and John.
I have had the incredible luck to have such a man for my father-in-law. Fuller and I have been so fortunate to share so much time and so many experiences with Sage and John. John, from the get-go, made me feel like a complete and valued member of the family. The trust and openness, the love and acceptance, I could not have imagined a warmer welcome into another family.
There are many things I learned from John during our long relationship. He led by example, and I learned by observation. John taught me the value of listening carefully before responding to what I surmised he might be about to say. He was thoughtful before he spoke and intentional upon delivery. His pace was measured and often quite deliberate, contrary to my rather dive in and go for it kind of style. More than once, he had to say to me, "Paige, could I finish, please?" In conversations with John, I found I needed to allow things to unfold without my being in such a rush to get my 2 cents in. And when he did finish, I inevitably came away with a jewel of perspective and insight.
He was charming, great-looking, intelligent, disciplined, fit, elegant, and kind. So very kind. He rarely gave advice, but rather would share his own experiences candidly, often with humor and a twinkle in his eye. He always seemed to consider his options and move forward with a decisiveness that was his own, whether it was to express an opinion that might not be popular or just to have one more chocolate. I lost my place. He was always interested in my work, amused that I liked to mow the lawn, and appreciated our mutual attention to detail concerning how to make a home comfortable and inviting. Many Kleenex boxes, wastebaskets, and flat spaces were all required in his environment. I learned how important it was to clean a newspaper and leave all reading materials just as we found them. He challenged my ideas without judgment, and he invested himself greatly in all of our children. He taught us to eliminate words like should and cannot from our vocabulary.
John provided me with a sterling example of the value of commitment to community. He was always working towards the betterment of this entire region, whether by championing a civic project or directing his financial resources to philanthropy. John's joy and pride were evident in his community awareness and his belief in the ripple effect of philanthropic giving. He supplied me with a strong and clear roadmap about how I can and will work to enhance the common good. John deeply valued and was devoted to family. He was a pillar of love and strength, not only to his own wife, children, and grandchildren, but also for the members of his extended family. He was accepting, inclusive, and welcoming. In turn, I trusted, respected, and loved him dearly. John showed me that time spent in engaged relationships with family will help surround me with love and affection for my entire life. His powerful example has become a precious gift.
John loved to go to the movies, and we would often go. And by the way, he would have popcorn and milk duds. He particularly loved movies with intelligent, sexy, and beautiful women. Probably because he was married to the most beautiful, sexy, and intelligent woman of them all.
Blackbird has spoken. Hi, everybody. Ira Goldstein. I'm Tessa's husband and John and Sage's son-in-law. Boy, I am living proof of John's incredible, inclusive love. As was never more obvious than now, what a pillar of the community here in Minneapolis that John was and is. He's always been so welcome home to me, even though we started out with me being a kind of provincial East Coaster who was so glad to be here in Milwaukee when we first met. My love and admiration and respect for John is such that in anticipation of speaking to this assemblage, my internal question was, what would John say? What would John do? And like manna from heaven, Conning and Fuller came up with this prayer, this meditation, a communication from the departed. In the Jewish tradition, which is said in some services before the mourner's prayer at a service. It's perfect, and it seems to me even more appropriate after hearing Roger Hale talk about how John enjoyed for his friends and companions to have a map on how to go forward. So here it is. When I die, give what's left of me away to children and old men that wait to die. And if you need to cry, cry for your brother walking the street beside you. And when you need me, put your arms around anyone and give them what you need to give me. I want to leave you something better than words or sounds. Look for me in the people I've known and loved. And if you cannot give me away, at least let me live in your eyes and not in your mind. You can love me best by letting hands touch hands, and by letting go of children that need to be free. Love doesn't die, people do. So when all that's left of me is love, give me away.
After all those wonderful tributes, I think we can all agree that while John may not have been a saint, he was one hell of a guy. There is a tradition in the theatre, a tradition which happens here nightly and in theatres all over the world, where an audience applaud the exit of a favourite performer. And as we say goodbye to John and listen to the stories that will live with us of his memory and all of his achievements, I'd like to ask you to join with the Cowles family.